As the clock struck midnight and October the 3rd became October the 4th, the crippling, paralyzing tandem blow of the joint cyber strike with the hard kill anti-satellite strikes had just occurred, with the entire border and every corner of the land erupting with heavy artillery barrages, missile barrages, loitering munition barrages, and much, much more, as scores of enemy aircraft flew overhead, violating American airspace. And there was very little that could even be done of it, as many American installations were immediately in the process of being missiled, shelled, rained on by rocket artillery, or downright overrun by ground forces themselves, all culminating in a completely paralyzing nationwide invasion. As it pertained to American air defense systems, the 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, itself the primary air defense element stationed at Fort Bliss, consisted of the 1st of the 43rd Air Defense Artillery Regiment, the 2nd of the 43rd Air Defense Artillery Regiment, and the 3rd of the 43rd Air Defense Artillery Regiment, all three being different Patriot missile system battalions within the 11th Artillery Brigade. There was also the 5th of the 52nd Air Defense Artillery Regiment, yet another Patriot missile system battalion belonging to the 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, as was the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd battalions of the 43rd Regiment. There was also 3 THAAD batteries. There was Alpha Battery of the 2nd Air Defense Artillery Regiment. There was Alpha Battery of the 4th Air Defense Artillery Regiment. And then there was Bravo Battery of the 2nd Air Defense Artillery Regiment, with both Bravo Battery of the 2nd Air Defense Artillery Regiment and Alpha Battery of the 4th Air Defense Artillery Regiment deployed to Alaska and the Middle East, respectively, leaving only Alpha Battery of the 2nd Air Defense Artillery Regiment remaining as the installation's sole THAAD provider, or Terminal High Altitude Air Defense System, which was there to provide an anti-ballistic missile shield. Although this would prove fruitless in the end, as the barrage of rocket and howitzer artillery, as well as the multitude of various types of missiles from 3 different nations primarily, as well as loitering munitions in the form of Chinese CH-901As, would strike every single solitary air defense site within the training areas of Fort Bliss. Likewise, as a main unit on the post, was the 1st Armored Division, with all 3 of its armored brigades currently present, although its Divisional Artillery Brigade, or DIV-ARTI as it's called affectionately, and its 15th Sustainment Brigade were currently on a training mission in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, having been sent there to prepare them ahead of an anticipated future deployment. Their Aviation Brigade was likewise, of the 1st Armored Division, on an overseas deployment to Europe at the time of the invasion, leaving only the 3 armored divisions, as well as the 5th Armored Brigade and 402nd Field Artillery Brigade, both being training units that specialized in training armored and artillery units respectively, although they weren't necessarily frontline combat units, they certainly had access to their personal combat equipment and small arms. They too being currently on the installation, as well as rear detachments for the aforementioned deployed units that were mentioned. The divisional artillery contained 3 artillery battalions, as well as the 4th of the 60th ADA Battalion, which was actually an air defense battalion that was part of the Field Artillery Brigade within the 1st Armored Division, or part of the Divisional Artillery, as a close-in air defense battalion primarily as it pertained to the 4th of the 60th. As for the units on the installation, the only artillery present was the individual field artillery battery that was part of each cavalry squadron, or basically battalion, but squadron in cavalry terms was a cavalry squadron, being a battalion in cav terms. Each had 1 artillery battery within it, and that would be the main artillery as far as the suppression of enemy artillery operations would be concerned, as it related to the Sino-Russ1an Coalition partners within this particular battle, within its scope. Mainly, the absolute first moves of the battle, as far as priority number 1, was a SEAD operation, or suppression of enemy air defenses, as these could absolutely not be permitted to operate, as these were generally generator-powered systems and weren't connected to the military networks, as the radars were independent and were generator-powered and also not connected to satellite, as the targeting radars could track targets from their location and relay the data directly to the systems, making it imperative to be able to utilize the electronic warfare present in the form of the 14th Signals Intelligence Regiment's Electronic Warfare Battalion within it to jam these systems ahead of the missile strikes, just as a precautionary measure, if you will, in order to ensure that no coalition aircraft would be swatted down in the process of eliminating these systems. As well as this was also the fact that the Tu-95 MSM versions were essentially large flying standoff missile carrying vehicles, and were not like most conventional strategic bombers, as the carrying of unguided or even guided dropped munitions was traded for carrying 16 long-range standoff cruise missiles apiece. Namely, in this instance, these were a mixture of KH-55s and KH-101s, the latter being a stealth cruise missile, and both had a range of over 1,500 miles. These missiles, between all 8 bombers of the squadron, carried a grand total of 128 missiles between them. 64 apiece, 64 of the older KH-55s and 64 of the more advanced KH-101s. 100 were fired at different targets within Fort Bliss itself, which included enemy air defenses for the most part, with some also being used to target motor pools and command and control centers on the installation, with the other 28 that were fired traveling much further north into the Santa Fe area to support their own troops operating in that zone, much like the Pakistani Army's 176th Missile Brigade, or Missile Regiment rather, right here off the map, which fired the fairly long-range Babur Alpha 1 longer-range cruise missiles, or intermediate range, were fired to support their own troops and the Iranian brethren operating in the Albuquerque area as their 18th Infantry Division and Iranian 3rd Armored Brigade of the Iranian Army were operating in the Albuquerque operation occurring right now, as these two specific units were Trojan Shock units. The 14th Pakistani Infantry Division itself was a Trojan Shock unit, beginning on CCP regime properties, skirting the edges of the installation itself near Alamogordo, New Mexico, as well as a bit further away in Las Cruces, as Las Cruces was a vital interstate junction that needed to be held at absolutely all costs, with the Combat Engineer Battalion itself specifically defending one of the largest CCP logistical and supply and support installations, being a large CCP ranch that was being used as a logistical stop for external invasion forces, as well as would be used for transport helicopters having freshly dropped off special operators that they picked up by the border who were in place temporarily to help suppress border paramilitary forces before being dropped off to go after local militia forces and their leader in the mountains, would stop and get fuel at this CCP property and fly on their round trip returning to Mexico, where they had their formal base, at least for the time being, as it would be possibly, for the time being, slightly perilous to park their helos at this CCP property with an active battle going on, as these transport helos were as good as gold, as the saying went, and were absolutely vital to the transportation of troops and logistics to hard-to-get-to areas as it related to certain ground formations relating to heavier units especially. These aviation assets provided a solution to the problem of getting up into the mountains, and were absolutely therefore vital and needed to be protected at all costs. As it pertained to areas adjacent to Route 10 or Interstate 10 running through the city of El Paso proper, a fairly large, medium-sized city, the forces of the 48th ID of the Ch1coms were avidly pushing into the city immediately right off the bat and engaging reactionary armed civilians, paramilitary border forces, as well as the 3rd Armored Brigade upon leaving Fort Bliss to contest the border crossing. As soon as the artillery and missiles began smashing all over their installation, the already quasi-prepared forces, as again, being that this was a border installation and already an active duty post, these active duty troops were held to a certain standard, and their readiness condition was therefore, according to the goings-on as far as the international tensions were concerned, their REDCON status had been raised insofar as it related to the combat troops, with the 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade forward deploying all of its assets into the training areas, whereas it already recently had a rotation going with its different battalions and their batteries into these areas, they now, by this point, as the nation was beginning to slowly, ever so slowly mobilize, the active forces started to take force protection measures, such as deploying their air defenses to guard their installations wherever they had such means available, such as Fort Bliss, Fort Sill, and Fort Hood, and therefore had already been set up and prepared to enact their role as defenders of the local airspace, as they had an approximately 120-mile radius insofar as it related to their systems. And as it stood right now, their systems were concentrated all on Fort Bliss as it related to the 11th and its subordinate battalions and THAAD battery. The very first occurrences, as various goings-on were literally happening all at the same time. Border crossings, artillery barrages, attack and reconnaissance helos crossing the border and attacking armed civilian elements, as well as border paramilitary posts, and also supporting Trojan units now assaulting the installation directly on all sides, trying to prevent a breakout towards the interstates from the installation-bound forces, as well as smash the installation and its forces themselves. While in the south, coming up from the south, the 48th Infantry Division was attempting to seize absolute total control over El Paso, and therefore I-10, as this was critical to the operation, as well as control of the El Paso International Airport, another major objective, and as well as smashing the American units themselves and aiding in the conquest of Fort Bliss itself. The advance was rapid, and within only the first hour, the Ch1coms were already reaching I-10, as well as the PAP forces of the Chinese rapidly penetrating across the border and engaging paramilitary at a few different major border crossings with artillery and direct ground assaults, while simultaneously on the installation, as Trojan shock units prepared to storm every end of the base, and the Americans opposing them on the installation prepared to fight back, and indeed there was a breakout attempt at a certain point in the fighting by the 1st Armored Brigade and its subordinate units. Within the installation, the SEAT operation had begun in earnest. This map only shows one very small portion of that operation underway. Within mere minutes of the anti-satellite and tandem cyber strike, with the inundation of the electronic warfare systems of the area from the Chinese forces of the 14th Group Army's electronic warfare assets, missiles began to rain down throughout the whole installation, largely against its air defense forces of its various Patriot batteries comprising their Patriot battalions, as well as their one THAAD battery, and missiles from several different nations began to rain down and strike. Hypersonic DF-100 cruise missiles fired by the Chinese forces of their 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces brigades of their Eastern Theater Command, as well as DH-10As, which were Chinese subsonic but long-range cruise missiles, such as right here. This was one of multiple DH-10As fired at the installation, these being DF-100s. This is only a 2 by 1 mile area, as Fort Bliss had a very large training area. And if incorporated with the White Sands missile range, it was many tens of miles long in length, as well as in width, being fairly wide as well, some approximately 50 miles at its widest point. Chinese longer-range rocket artillery of their 300mm rockets fired by their 1 PHL-03 battery began to smash campsites and parked vehicles pertaining to these Patriot batteries, destroying a massive area, a roughly 1 kilometer by 1.2 mile area with their rocket saturation. There was also longer range 155mm artillery fire, this actually coming from the 48th Infantry Division instead of the 148th Field Artillery Brigade, as the artillery belonging to the 48th Infantry Division was much closer, as from Juarez across the Rio to the west, to the direct west, was actually quite a bit further away from the main training areas, so therefore they fired their 300mm rockets, which had the range to reach, whereas the 48th was much closer and could fire their 37-mile-long in range WS-35R rocket-assisted satellite-guided 155mm shells from their PLZ-05 155mm self-propelled howitzers, equipping their 2 artillery battalions within their infantry division. CH-901A loitering munitions had also likewise been fired from the 48th Infantry Division, or 48th ID, from its headquarters battalion, from specialized drone sections, firing volley after volley of these drones, 48 at a time, from a TEL-like system with 48 tubes, able to fire 48 of these at a time. As the saying went, the heat was on, and it was also incumbent on these drone sections to put out as many of these as they conceivably could. They operated many manually, batch after batch, but some they simply put on AI targeting mode and left them to their own devices, no pun intended, as they sought out enemy ground targets, including MRAPs, trucks, and portable buildings where they weren't already being struck by long-range Russian KH-55s or KH-101s or Chinese DF-100s or DH-10As, or Russian Kinzhals fired from further away, from 60 miles away to be exact, from their MiG-31K squadron. These two being Kinzhals, blasting the remainder of this THAAD battery into oblivion. These massive craters being where cruise or ballistic missiles have already struck, and everything immediately surrounding these large craters here are gone. between these two strikes is about to be a large crater, and nothing's going to be left. With follow-up artillery fire from Chinese artillery just to ensure the destruction of these systems. That includes their command vehicles, radar, and truck-based THAAD systems themselves. There's also tents set up for the forces, trucks for supplies, and missiles, and everything that goes with the THAAD battery. Parts, components, electronic components, along with all the troops running around like chickens with their heads cut off. As all of this is occurring, the blasting, the sheer magnitude of the cacophony of it all was far too much for many of them to handle. This convoy of gun trucks, essentially MRAPs with their crew serves attached for securing the site of all these air defense assets out in these hinterlands of the post, these training ranges. Patrolling the road, they were attacked by Ch901A loitering munitions with heat warheads or high explosive anti-tank, which was nothing for them to destroy an MRAP, as they could even destroy an M1 Abrams with that type of warhead, as well as artillery strikes all throughout the road, getting any that the loitering munitions didn't already strike. All of these Chinese artillery strikes are already hitting campsites, trucks, Patriot battery systems, which were set up by this point. This being a Patriot missile system setup, truck, like your LMTVs, HETs, and your radar site troops. They're all being shelled mercilessly by these Chinese satellite-guided long-range rocket-assisted shells, 155 shells, in addition to the vast array of missiles. Here's even an Iranian Shahab-2 fired at this site. As you can see, this Shahab-2 is about to... The Chinese artillery already blew this Patriot system over here away, and its operators, crew, as well as these troops over here, and these troops right within the edges of the blast radius. There were already troops in the blast that were annihilated, but cut down these troops on the edge. This Shahab-2 is about to crash and blast this entire system and remaining forces away, as it's highlighted in the Iranian color, the violet. You can see the partial violet on this means that the missiles engaging this and this, with its blast radius being fairly large, but it's also destroyed by Ch901As with their heat warheads. So it's literally being hit by a missile. You know, it's being, the blast radius is affecting it, as well as the loitering munitions, which bam, 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 each take a vehicle. So enormous was the destruction here. Here comes a DH-10A, subsonic long-range Chinese cruise missile. The same one, by the way, that was launched at the heliport of the paramilitary, the American paramilitary forces at the last battle that occurred at the Ranches Penitas West and Dolores battle. That was a DH-10A cruise missile that had been fired from the Chinese Missile Forces Brigade elements that crashed into that heliport and destroyed the Huey helicopters belonging to the Border Paramilitary and Customs Forces. This is destroying these 4 trucks at this parking lot out here in the range. This building had already been destroyed. Here, this was a range building, as the ranges and training areas and many military installations sometimes have either sheds or buildings located by parking areas for the range safeties or security, or even camping out in, as far as the units, if need be. You know, basically your quintessential logistical type facility for such a larger installation, and for the purposes given. You have artillery smashing it into rubble. With all these cruise and ballistic missile strikes leaving enormous craters smoking all over the training ranges. And this is only one segment of the SEAD operation. The training areas are large, and the entire brigade's remaining elements that weren't overseas deployed were all deployed out in the training areas with live ammunition for their small arms and for their Patriot and THAAD and single THAAD battery, and for their Patriot batteries that comprise their Patriot battalions, and for their single THAAD battery, which had been eviscerated by these Kinzhals, these KH-47 strikes, as well as loitering munitions looking for vehicle-based targets. This MRAP trying to flee gets destroyed by this loitering CH-901 overhead, with these targeting these vehicles, these gun trucks on patrol for security operations going up the road, but they were also hit by Ch1com 155 long-range artillery shells, rocket-assisted, satellite-guided, right onto the tops of them. This truck speeding off, as this artillery shell impacted and destroyed this truck and eliminated these troops here, alongside with this missile strike, as this truck sped off, the shrapnel from the artillery blast was hitting the side of the vehicle as it was speeding down the way. You know, when it blasted, shrapnel was flying this direction as it was moving. As it finally got to this point, and the blasting was occurring right here, destroying a campsite along for the troops, along with vehicles and Patriot systems. The driver and TC got out of the truck and just ran up this hill. And as they were running up the hill, they were spotted by these loitering munitions who now didn't have a target within the area since this was destroyed by this one. And they both came down and eliminated these, with another one destroying the now abandoned truck. 2 trucks fled the area up here right as these Russian KH-55s are flying in. This one hit this area right here, this parking lot with 4 LMTV trucks, a portable building for showers and bathrooms, and these 2 tents set up here adjacent to this parking area and the road. One KH-55 blew this into a crater, and 2 more coming in impacted this area right here, the same area where the Chinese artillery was impacting and blasting these trucks away and these individual troops. These were just out of the blast radius of this group of shells and this group here, which destroyed this truck and more. As again, there would obviously be more destruction within the actual blast itself. This is just the outer edges. These missiles hit and destroyed this Patriot system, radar station, and troops here that the artillery didn't get. These troops got away. They obviously got in these trucks and hurried off. But that's not to say that they didn't get destroyed in another adjacent area, as this again is just a miniature segment of a much, much larger engagement with the SEAD operations now unfolding literally all over the map throughout the whole training ranges, as that's where the 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade was set up. It's another DF-100 hypersonic cruise missile flying this way to hit targets further out in the ranges. Missiles were flying everywhere. Tactical ballistic missiles like the Shahab and these hypersonic Kinzhal air-launched hypersonic ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, DH-10A, DH-10A, DF-100, DF-100s, Russian KH-55s up in this corner, flying to hit these targets here and here. As this was all going on simultaneously, while all these targets were being viciously ripped apart, blasted to pieces, the air defense was now, in a matter of mere minutes, totally annihilated. All as this was occurring, ISR assets were now in place with, as I said earlier, scores of aircraft having already passed overhead, traveling to their respective AOs, or battle spaces where they were to be operating, with only the Russian Tu-95 bomber squadron staying relatively within the area, as they were doing an RTB, as they'd fired their standoff missiles from Big Bend, which were hitting the area, as afterward they now flew over the area on an arc to do a round trip back to base, with the MiG-31K squadron firing their Kinzhals, as well as KH-58 anti-radiation missiles in support of the Trojan Shock Troops, which were now attacking the installation perimeter. All of these Trojan Shock elements belonging to the 14th Pakistani Infantry Brigade began on CCP regime properties between Alamogordo and White Sands, along the sides of the installation, including right outside of El Paso here, between the city and the installation, on the edges of the city itself, and also in Las Cruces, 3 battalions of it. There's Combat Engineer Battalion and 2 Mechanized Infantry Battalions beginning there to secure the interstate. As part of interstate security operations, this whole battalion would leave Las Cruces, where it began on the edge of it on a CCP property, and attack an armed civilian cluster that cropped up as this WZ-7 drone relayed the data to the Ch1com AI systems, and in turn its intelligence analysts, as well as to its combat data links, and shared all their updates with their allies, including their very good ally Pakistan and their units. Now, Pakistan was not anywhere near as drone heavy as China, or even as much as Russia or Iran, which both of those nations used a lot of drones as well. Not as many as China, but they were definitely right up there with China in terms of their reliance upon drones. But Pakistan could rely upon China and or Russia and even Iran for steady feeds of intelligence and data from their amazing constellation of high and low flying spy drones, spy planes, and satellites. Although Pakistan did have some military satellites of its own, it was only really lacking in the drone department. That's not to say that it didn't have UAVs. It did, but nowhere near as many as the Chinese, their main ally, possessed. As the fighting got more and more intense, the elements of the 1st Armored Brigade of the 1st Armored Division, completely in the dark and completely confused about what was occurring, not knowing exactly where the enemy was and where they were even coming from, or much of anything else that was going on, now had to depend almost solely, entirely, on runners, as did the other comprising armored brigades of the 1st Armored Division, with these forces now starting to use some of their individual soldiers as runners between their different units, having them take gators, old Army favorite of the American Army as far as an ATV, driving gators around the post from battalion to battalion, HHC to HHC, or headquarters and headquarters company, the commanders of each subordinate brigade. The overall commander of the post, as well as 1st Armored Division commander and commander of the 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, as well as all the other tenant unit commanders that were still present, were hurriedly escorted to what was perceived to be safer, more secure areas on the installation, although more often than not, this wouldn't be the case, as by this point, so many different missiles, rocket artillery, and howitzer artillery was raining down on the installation, along with loitering munitions being a steady, constant peril, that it was extremely dangerous to be caught out in the open. And some of the commanders were simply unable or too paralyzed with fear to leave their offices or wherever they were during the current situation. As things went from horrifying to hellish, many lives were already being lost all throughout the installation, along with many vehicles in the motor pool of the different subordinate units being completely annihilated. All of this, as the border crossings into El Paso, the city itself, were already well underway, as again, all of this occurred well under the first hour of the invasion, with border paramilitary units quickly and easily overrun at border crossings, along with other segments where full battalions crossed more shallow, less steep banks of the into El Paso of the Rio Grande River, coming up on the other side into El Paso, at first only encountering bands of armed civilians before running into the actual military forces present. At the border, where the People's Armed Police elements of the 18th PAP Light Armor Brigade were crossing, one engagement was occurring within the small border town of Columbus, New Mexico, where PAP shock forces, along with their own artillery providing them support, with their own artillery battalion being arranged in a very similar manner to the battalions comprising the field artillery of the 4th PAP Artillery Regiment in the previous battle, with the only difference being that this being only one battalion was comprised of 6 122mm Type 83 towed howitzers and one battery, the 7th being a 130mm Type 59-I or -1 Roman numeral artillery battery. They were set up in the exact same way as was the 4th Artillery Regiment in the previous battle, their troops having well-prepared firing positions, having laid their howitzers by utilizing their collimators and getting their batteries arrayed facing their target areas, as well as digging foxholes on the ends of each gun line for certain troops to man machine gun emplacements for security reasons. These forces now laid down heavy fire on targets within a 15-mile area along the border. As these batteries, unlike the 4th PAP Artillery Regiment, were somewhat more spaced out within a 5-mile area and were generally side by side instead of layered, they were side by side, giving them slightly more range as the end battery could fire on targets further to the west or east, respectively, as it pertained to the current battlefront. Columbus, being the small town right here, was now under assault by 2 PAP light tank battalions and 1 PAP armored infantry, or for the PAP's categorization, heavy infantry battalions. These 3 were assaulting the Columbus area, breaking through there en route further north. As the artillery fire from their 122mm and single 130mm battery was underway, all combined, batteries plural, they began to hit targets in the Columbus border crossing, as well as armed civilians to their northwest, and an additional border crossing that was located at Santa Terrace, which was another small town located close to the Rio, where Texas and New Mexico and Mexico all co-joined. Here at the Columbus border crossing, while other PAP companies belonging to the 3 assaulting battalions literally just bypassed Columbus and went around it, 2 companies from one of the 2 light tank battalions, with 1 whole light tank battalion and the armored infantry battalion going around Columbus completely, with the rest of the light tank battalion, its 6 other battalions, leaving only 2, 1 armored infantry and 1 light tank, to storm up and through Columbus itself. As this had been a segment of border wall with guard posts, these armored vehicles were perfect for the job of smashing through it, as this wall had been built in previous years. Although it was an incomplete wall, and mostly for show, certain aspects of it did prove to be a nuisance as far as it related to the individual infantry soldier, although oftentimes this could be handled with the proper munitions utilized as it related to penetrating the border fencing. As this battle at the border was underway, the American paramilitary forces in this region had been bolstered insofar as it related to their numbers, as even before the invasion, there had been a hiring spree as it related to these paramilitary elements, as well as transfers between other paramilitary elements to these paramilitary elements. One example being a large transfer between the Department of the Homeland Security and sending them to the Border Patrol as a sort of lateral transfer, if you will. Now, here on the ground, there are pictured elements of the two attacking companies, although the entire two attacking companies are not within this small map segment, this being just a simple 1 by 1 kilometer area. Not even a full mile by mile, but 1 by 1 kilometer area. This is the Mexican side. These are Mexican border authority buildings here. These are the American ones in green. Now, before the invasion even kicked off, as mentioned in the previous battle, since Mexico was considered a friendly nation for allowing the basing of the coalition's troops on its soil and fully cooperating, their border agents were warned minutes ahead of the invasion's actual kickoff and told to flee their posts immediately. And they all complied, as they were fully aware what was to come by that point, as they had been warned by a PAP paramilitary soldier with a translator to warn the local border forces to flee the area. As it was now midnight at the exact timing of this crossing here, it was now completely dark on the American side of the border, with the cyber and anti-satellite strikes, the cyber attack removing the grid, including the lighting, the telecom, and the internet, as well as with the internet that included the military networks as well as other types of networks relied upon by the American regime. This highly affected the border paramilitary forces, who, now in the dark, scrambled outside as shells now began to impact everywhere, leaving only 80 inside their main building here, as well as 20 in an auxiliary building located across the thoroughfare. There were 2 large parking lots in Columbus immediately upon crossing the border, with the border authorities of the border paramilitary forces occupying this general area and the buildings within that area in this complex right here. And these 2 parking lots here and here. The rest of this, these were all civil buildings. These were all businesses and homes. But right in this area was where the primary attack was focused by the PAP. While, again, larger PAP forces in total totally bypassed this tiny town of Columbus. 2 whole companies, 1 armored infantry and 1 light tank battalion, the light tank battalion of Type 62G light tanks, as well as their armored infantry consisting of Type 86G infantry fighting vehicles and Type 63 armor personnel carriers, completely attacking up the middle, while their 122mm and 130mm artillery shells splashed throughout the town, already razing many of its buildings to the ground, as the PAP cared not at all whatsoever at all for the civilian population of the land being invaded, as they saw this as a war of extermination. There was no such thing in their vocabulary as it related to the PAP as collateral damage. Therefore, the town of Columbus, though little it was among the first areas to completely understand the nature of this war insofar as the sheer brutality of it. There were overflow tents located within the areas surrounding these paramilitary structures on the American side, as, again, the security had been increased due to all the international tensions, and once again taking the border crisis seriously and attempting in vain, far too little, far too late, to do something about it. And as these forces were being moved into the area, before they could find proper housing, they were staying in tents provided by the agencies. And these tents were targeted by artillery strikes that were drone-directed artillery strikes, as the drones relayed the data directly to the FDCs of the firing batteries in their FDC vehicles, which therefore fed out the firing missions to the gun lines, being the whole battery, and therefore resulted in the artillery striking this small town and practically razing it to the ground, with 3 direct missions called upon the largest main building itself, with 80 personnel still inside at the time of the strikes. As at the moment this map is shown, these strikes are already occurring right here when the map is shown, as so. And where the circles and X's are, as in every map, that means shells are imminently about to strike. These armor personnel carriers, these M113s, are not military, but have been handed down due to special programs where the military hands down old equipment to paramilitary agencies, such as local SWAT teams and even the paramilitary agencies responsible for the border and security of the homeland, if you will, and others like it. These agencies, however, though, were equipped with some crew serve weapons to go with their acquisitions in terms of armor personnel carriers. They were given some M250 cals and also 240 Bravos, which fired a 7.62 by 51 NATO belt-fed ammunition. The 50 cals especially were somewhat helpful in this situation, although it just wasn't enough for what they were actually up against. They weren't fighting off a rogue criminal element or anything like this. They were fighting off the most powerful invasion force ever assembled any time in history, anywhere in the world. As PAP shock troops, as one tiny part of this enormous undertaking, advanced through the border checkpoint as far as it related to a tank platoon racing on ahead, while PAP dismounted armored infantry troops advanced and stopped right in front of the Mexican side's guard posts and used their Type 74 flamethrowers to completely torch the American buildings on their side of the border, while other PAP troops, after HJ-73C anti-tank missiles were fired from an infantry fighting vehicle which blew part of the fencing down, these dismounted infantry troops advanced by bounding and covering, with them bounding and then them bounding and then them bounding tactically, while the heavy machine gunners of the Type 63 armor personnel carriers and the 30mm autocannon of the Type 86G infantry fighting vehicle engaged all these MRAPs, which had 240 Bravos and M250 cals mounted on them, and they were engaged in a back-and-forth firefight. As these paramilitary forces and their gunners and their MRAPs seen the vehicles as priority targets and thought that somehow, someway, their fire could affect them. And although the fire did cause the dismounted infantry to hurry and get behind their own vehicles that they dismounted from in a rolling shield formation, they did little to nothing to the very fronts of these vehicles. Although they badly dented the fronts of the Type 63s, they didn't quite penetrate. These dismounted infantry troops not only had Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade light armor systems, anti-armor systems, they also carried man-portable HJ-08 tube-fired anti-tank missiles, a proper anti-tank missile, which could destroy a main battle tank, and fired these at these MRAPs in tandem with the vehicle fire coming from the infantry fighting vehicles, powerful armor-piercing 30mm autocannon rounds, in addition to the heavy 12.7mm machine guns also being levied at these targets. As paramilitary elements got into their M113s for additional protection and firepower, mounting their crew serves atop of them at the initiation of hostilities, they hurriedly tried to advance against the Ch1coms. Although this was to little avail, as drone-directed fire missions were called in right on this column as it moved forward, and 122 and 130mm artillery completely annihilated this column in tandem with the vehicle fire coming from 600 or 700 rather meters away at this point, as this is a 1 by 1 kilometer map, so 700 meters. Before these vehicles now advanced forward and smashed their way into another segment of the border fencing. All while that was occurring here by these forces, and these light tanks destroyed this armor personnel carrier with their rifled main tank gun, the lead tank, the lead light tank, the lead Type 62G. They raced ahead, and as artillery had already struck this building and these forces here with the dismounted infantry and vehicles of the armored infantry, eliminating these vehicles here, and also firing at these vehicles here, the light tanks had no problem dispatching these forces as the artillery struck and destroyed these trucks here, these paramilitary SUVs and pickup trucks of the border forces, and eliminated many of their men who were in the blast themselves, not just on the radius. The armored personnel carrier here, the M113, along with these dismounts, was trying to run and come down to this area and get behind the rubble to stop forces from breaking through here. And they were using their headlights to try to see, as all they had was their lights and night vision. And they had no working street lights or anything in the town, as the grid was completely gone. So they tried to fire at whatever they could feasibly see, although now that smoke was all over the air from the various blasts throwing debris and smoke clouds all throughout the battle space, the IR capabilities of the PAP's vehicles, like their Type 68G, and also their goggles of such, could see through some of the smoke, although not where it was thickest, as smoke had a heat signature of its own and could obscure heat signatures of individuals that were further away, but they could certainly see closer where individuals were. And also they had night vision as well. These light tanks of the PAP, these platoons of Type 62Gs, were already busy pelting the fence and blowing humongous holes in it with their elongated rifled 105mm tank guns, their main tank guns, as well as firing their 7.62 by 54mm coax machine guns, and heavy machine gun turret gunners firing their 12.7mm heavy machine guns, while this infantry platoon of armored infantry troops smashed through the border fence here, as the tank fire completely kept these forces occupied, as well as destroying them almost outright. As these forces tried to move in to give reinforcements, as these forces were eliminated almost immediately within a few minutes, they fired back, but they were wiped out fairly fast by the tank fire. Another platoon of light tanks had since broken through the border fencing a bit further down and already was racing into town from this end in a bid to essentially encircle whoever survived of these forces running into this area here by surrounding the area with these forces before moving on to surround other parts within the town, while, again, the larger units were already bypassing the town, with these two companies going through the town to clear it out, with the artillery having completely destroyed these paramilitary forces and their structures and their vehicles and their parking lot and overflow tents, as well as the town's buildings on the periphery of this border crossing area here. Roughly 320 different paramilitary troops lay completely dead by the end of this operation, and no prisoners were taken. Everybody was eliminated, even the townspeople. The PAP troops, at the very end of this battle at this particular border crossing, advanced through and out of the town to rejoin their light tank battalion that they had originally split off of, which itself had already gone around the town with the two other full battalions, the full light tank battalion here, the full mechanized infantry battalion here, and most of the rest of the light tank battalion here had all bypassed the town and moved deep into the state by this point, advancing a total of 20 miles before encountering yet another armed civilian band. But as of right this moment, they just cleared the town, and they had a ways to travel before this next encounter. Meanwhile, there were other fights occurring on the border, firefights and artillery barrages. Outright complete destruction of the whole city of El Paso was already well underway. At midnight, as midnight struck, the border crossing in that particular area was likewise conducted under heavy artillery fire as combat engineers, just a few companies from the combat engineer battalion of the 48th Infantry Division, were, along with a mechanized infantry division, or battalion rather, of the 48th Infantry Division, were crossing and engaging 300 paramilitary American forces at the border crossing within El Paso. One of several main border crossings, it should be said, but this being one of the main ones here, which most of it was obliterated completely by an enormous artillery barrage of 152 and 155 millimeter HE shells, or high explosive shells, totally saturating these two crossings here and here, just behind the bridges themselves, annihilating large groupings of these paramilitary forces, as some of these were their administrative buildings right here where these two bridges cross the river, as well as crossing the bridges in great strength and eliminating those who survived on the banks of the river itself. These combat engineer forces, also in line formation here, in a wedge formation moving up to get into a line formation, as well as their armored engineering vehicle with a 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun, were firing across at this MRAP and these paramilitary forces here, while other elements of their battalion were crossing and punching through this first gate on the border crossing right here. This armored engineering vehicle right on the other side, first vehicle to cross. With this infantry fighting vehicle, this being a ZBD-04, having fired its anti-tank missile pods of HJ-08 anti-tank missiles at these two different MRAPs, firing its 30mm autocannon armed with armor-piercing ammunition, as well as its 100mm cannon with high explosive shells, blasting these paramilitary forces into pieces between these two buildings right here at the gate. Other combat engineer troops, dismounted, are running along the bank. They have their armed robots, as the combat engineers are some of the units that operate these types of unmanned robotic systems as it relates to these quad-legged armed robots that boast a 12.7mm heavy machine gun on them. Similar to the Chinese Special Operations Forces, the combat engineers being a specialty force, as they are designated the role of recon and force operations and clearing obstacles. While doing so, they are often given these types of robots for demolitions or removing certain obstacles, and also armed robots to assist them in their recon and force operations as it relates to the combat engineers. Two of these armed robots about to cross with these troops and line of armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles, two armored engineering vehicles right here, robot, dismounted troops in a rolling shield with its side-facing rolling shield, a left side rolling shield with their gunner facing across the river, with troops in a line formation in this park, this riverside park right here. There's the Mexican side of the border crossing. This whole column is crossing rapidly, crossing this bridge, seizing it intact, like they seized this other one intact and already crossed, and before moving over to this side, while all of this artillery fire is going on. And of course, they're not going to move too close to it, where it would be danger close, but they are moving fairly close to it. While some of these border guards trying to run away here are captured, while the rest are simply annihilated, like this vehicle, this MRAP trying to flee, being destroyed by a personnel-wielded HJ-08 anti-tank missile. This one destroyed by the artillery right here, simply being too close to the radius of the blast. These guys were eliminated by small arms. It's two that survived, captured. These guys cut off, eliminated. As soon as they pop out, they're eliminated. They're totally cut off, fired at from two sides, like a kill box, an L-shaped kill box, fired at from here and from here, as these vehicles turn this way and others go up this way, up the street that way. These guys were already eliminated right off the bat. As soon as the hostilities began, they were fired at from an IFV, armed robot, line of troops hiding in the grass in this park, this riverside park, in the tall grass along the river, along the Rio. As soon as midnight struck, the lights went out on the other side of the river. They started lighting them up. Again, these border crossings occurred within a matter of minutes. All well within the first hour. We're talking within 15 minutes these border crossing operations occurred, whether through the Columbus example in New Mexico or whether through the example in El Paso. Along with the SEAD operation, there are the suppression of enemy air defense operations, with all the missile strikes in the installation literally occurring at exactly midnight, from midnight spanning also just a matter of minutes. along with the border crossing operations, that all occurred at the same time. The SEAD operations and the border crossings were a simultaneous event, along with the enormous artillery barrages, not only striking all throughout El Paso and the installation, but also even small towns like Columbus and further inland. The Battle of El Paso and Fort Bliss will continue in the next video, as this is a very in-depth, lengthy battle to cover. In the next video, the fighting in El Paso expands, as well as the fighting conducted by the Trojan Shock forces already inside of the land, and by the PAP forces smashing their way in, along with the special operations mission against a known potential partisan leader who is currently an organized civilian militia leader hiding in the mountains.